Forgive me if I'm a bit slow. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my PhD research, which I'm doing at the University of York at the minute. I'm in my final year just now. So what I'm going to hopefully kind of present to you is some really preliminary findings and thoughts. So these are not kind of full analysis yet, but hopefully just a starting point and something that will be interesting for us to think about together. Many of you probably won't need the background in this. We do just to explain a little bit what I am talking about. So to define an unaccompanied asylum-seeking young person, I kind of have to define an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child first. So there's the official Home Office definition. It's a child under the age of 18 arriving in the UK alone to claim asylum. Now this definition here is the definition that I'm using for the purposes of my research of what an unaccompanied young person is. Now that's not an official definition, that's just kind of what I've chosen to define it as. So kind of a former unaccompanied child who's now between the ages of 17 and 25, and I've kind of mirrored the leaving care age, choosing those ages to kind of try and mirror where they'll be in kind of social service processes. So when I talk about an unaccompanied young person, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not going to run through all that, that's just kind of to explain really briefly what happens to an unaccompanied child and the process that they go through and how they become looked after by the local authority, and they may or may not receive refugee status at some point during that process. So what I'm interested in is not necessarily unaccompanied children, there's lots of really good research on that. But what happens when they get a bit older and things get a bit shakier, when they're 17 to 25, often they have to reapply to remain in the UK or to kind of regularise their status completely, and they're also leaving care at that time, so there's lots of different things going on. And I wanted to explore this through looking at social networks in the broadest possible sense. So I interviewed 18 unaccompanied young people between those ages, and with many of them I did follow-up interviews. It isn't longitudinal in the sense that there's a set time when I interviewed them. I just interviewed them if they got in touch with me because something had happened, something drastic had happened to them. So it was more kind of their prerogative to kind of get in touch and see what happened. And I also interviewed local professionals, voluntary sector workers and social workers, personal assistants, all these kind of people. So kind of a broad spectrum of people. And the kind of key thing to note about the young people kind of in this transitional period between 17 to 25 is that they'll be experiencing very different pathways to adulthood depending on what their immigration status is like at that point. So they may have refugee status and be reasonably settled about being able to stay in the UK. They may still be awaiting a decision or an appeal decision and therefore be quite uncertain, or they may have exhausted all their appeal rights and be kind of technically illegally in the UK, and that really massively affects, as I'm sure you know, all their entitlements. Has a huge impact on what their transition to adulthood may or may not look like. So to move on to the interesting bit, to the findings, I've kind of split this down into time, space and social networks because they're kind of the key things that kind of came up. So I'll try and give equal attention to all them. The main thing, I think, when looking at time is this idea of futures and imagined futures. And a number of scholars have noted that migration itself is extremely future-orientated. There's an idea of a better future in that act of migrating. But also being a young person is kind of a really future-orientated time where you're making big decisions about what your future might look like. So I think looking at what these people want from their future and how they envision that is kind of important to understand. This is a kind of generalisation, but many of the young people who had that kind of more settled refugee status had these really clear, positive, imagined futures. With clear goals and plans. They were big dreams, but they weren't just dreams. They were things that were thought through. They had these amazing kind of life plans of how they were going to reach these really important goals. And they aimed high for massive achievements educationally, in work, and in their family and personal lives. And that was really positive. But also the way they expressed these imagined futures was through this really clear narrative that connected their past experiences, where they currently were, and their future. There was a really coherent narrative coming through from people, which was really positive and amazing to kind of hear. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about Em, who's a 21-year-old Afghani male. I've got a picture of a bridge to remind me. Oh, it does weird things. Oh, that, okay, saved it. I didn't realise that happened. That's magical. So this young man has currently just completed a civil engineering degree and is going on to do a master's in civil engineering, and the reason that he's chosen to do that is because he wants to build bridges in Kabul, his home city, because his uncle was a bridge builder and built a famous bridge in Kabul. And so it's kind of like a really neat kind of metaphor for how you can connect those dots. You know, he wants to go back, he wants to rebuild these bridges, and it's a connection to family and to place. Which stretches out into the distant future. He doesn't want to go back just yet. It's not safe for him to go back yet, but he can imagine a safe space in the future where he can kind of live out that kind of cycle. For others, it's kind of a less kind of clear-cut story, but it's still there. This is a 19-year-old Afghani male who said this. He said, "My dad was always telling me, yesterday's yesterday, and today's yesterday. You should think about tomorrow. If you hope for something for your heart, anything can be possible," and I don't forget those words. So even though this young man had lost all his family and had no family remaining in Afghanistan and no family over here either, something about kind of remembering the past and taking on the morals and values of a family that you don't have anymore was kind of pushing him forward and driving forward his future. And he had, you know, really strong goals and aspirations for the future as well, based on these kind of family expectations and hopes that they had for him before his migration. Conversely, people who were much less certain about their status, either because they hadn't had a decision or because they'd exhausted all their appeal rights in like quite a desperate kind of situation. And they couldn't really imagine a future. And so often in social work we talk about, you know, planning for these multiple possible futures with unaccompanied young people. But rather than being able to plan for multiple futures, they couldn't imagine any future at all. It was just far too dark to kind of imagine anything. And that's, you know, maybe expected, but strikingly, they also couldn't really comprehend their past and kind of create that coherent narrative that some of the other young people could. They didn't want to talk about the past, they couldn't remember the past, the reason they came here, their whole migration journey had become very fragmented and blurry in their minds. So there was a really interesting connection, I think, between how you kind of, or how these young people experience the past, present and future, in that if one breaks down, it all kind of breaks down together. Not being able to imagine a future just doesn't just deprive you of that, it makes the present and the past very blurry as well. Harriet Ward has talked about this in general with care leavers and drawn on a psychologist called Lalonde, and she talks about identity formation and sort of continuities and discontinuities, and I think that's something that's happening here that'd be interesting to think about. And this just reflects one of the young people who was experiencing this kind of breakdown of past, present and future. When he was asked to draw a time tree, which is a bit like a timeline, and write something at the top for what's happening in the future and something at the bottom for what his past felt like, he just wrote these two words, fear and fear. And they kind of mirrored each other, but that's kind of what it had broken down to. You couldn't imagine anything, it was just broken down to that one kind of overwhelming emotion. Briefly on space and place, these are the things that were most important to young people in terms of where they were and how they experienced being in a particular place. The city was the most important thing. Young people would go to extreme lengths to live within the city and not move out to rural locations, giving up really lovely foster placements, but which were really stable, just because they felt a desperate desire to be in the city and to be with their community, which kind of this represents. And that's not just cultural ethnic communities, but people of the same age, people with the same interests. And so whilst a lot of young people found a church community that was really important to them, there's lots of those in Leeds, particularly the Eritrean church in Leeds. It was also about young people, about similar interests, so not just cultural and ethnic communities, but finding people who loved the same things you did, understood the world in the same way you did, which they couldn't access in rural communities quite as much. But then, of course, there's also kind of space and distance and lots of transnational kind of connections which were difficult to negotiate, not just with people in their home countries, but with family and friends that are kind of scattered across the globe. So there was also a sense of being at a distance from everything all the time, and trying to kind of recapture all these different places and spaces. Everyone seemed to live in the ether. It was very difficult to pinpoint a place where people were, where you could find people, where your family were. That kind of all exploded a little bit, and so finding a place was quite difficult. So the main kind of thing was about social networks, and these are the main kind of things that I want to think about, and I'll just pick on one if I get time to kind of explain in a bit more depth. I've got
fine.
Oh, right, yeah, good, I will do. So, the main thing to note, I guess, is the complexity of these social networks. And I guess there can be an outside perception that unaccompanied young people are extremely isolated. They arrive here with no one and no network. But actually, they manage to build these incredibly complex networks extremely quickly. And they're still bringing social networks with them, those transnational networks with them as well. Again, almost by definition, like family doesn't really come up in the definition of unaccompanied young people. They are alone and without this family. But most of the young people I spoke to did have family in the UK, had managed to track down family or reunify with family, or had just accidentally found family while they were here. So family's a massive thing, both in the physical now, but also still the most important part of their network. Even young people who had had no contact with their family for a long time wrote down their family members as the most important part of their social network. Something that's really important to think about in terms of what a social network is. Does it have to be someone physically present for them to have the most overwhelming effect on your world? There were also extremely diverse networks, you know, within the sample. Like young people's networks are very different, very individual, but also within that one person's network there'd be a lot of diversity in terms of cultural, ethnic places. Everything was different. You know, they were really mixing it up. They weren't, you know, kind of going, okay, I just want to stick with people who are like me. There was a real desire to go out into the world and find people from all different places for all different experiences. But these networks were obviously in a period of transition because they're transitioning to adulthood, because things were happening with their immigration status. So it's kind of interesting to kind of work out which friendships and which relationships were going to last the distance and which were starting to break down at this period of time. And a lot of that was going on in their peer networks. And in particular, those young people who weren't able to access higher education found it really difficult. Because their friends who did access higher education because they had some status were able to go on and make all these new fabulous social networks at university, while they were kind of left behind, really. So that was something pretty interesting. And that's one of the ways in which status is obviously affects how these social networks look. The thing I want to talk about most of all, just to end on, is the issue of control and agency within social networks. And I think often we talk about social support, and I don't really like that term because I think it kind of assumes that social networks are always good and always supportive, and all the people that you know are good and supportive, and that's not obviously always the case. I just wanted to give you the example of this young lady. She was 20 and she's from Eritrea, and where she found the most difficulty in her social network was actually with her family. She managed to find her family. Her dad was living in Norway and her sister came to live with her, it was like, that's an amazing story, that's fabulous, that's wonderful, but not always so. And these are kind of the quotes that she said throughout her interview about the difficulties that she had with suddenly having the family back in her social network, having kind of lived on her own and being really kind of resourceful by herself since the age of 14. So she talks about how her family can control you. She talks about cousins that she had here in England who she lived with for a time, and how they were always kind of bringing her dad and trying to get her in trouble. They were trying to kind of control her, especially kind of her sexual behaviour, who her boyfriends were and who she was going out with. And then she found the boyfriends who were from her local community had similar kind of intentions of trying to control her. And she's like, I just can't take it when people tell me what to do because I've been not in control of my life this whole time. And I think that encapsulates quite a lot about this particular group of young people. They're very resilient, they've been on their own, so it can be very difficult for them then to reunite with family or have those controlling influences when they're kind of the whole thing that keeps them going is the idea that they are resilient and resourceful and independent. So that was really interesting. The last thing to say about control and agency was that when I began this, I kind of assumed that social workers and social services would be the source of this kind of control, and they're really not. They're the people who enable the agency.